Hello, everyone. I have worked as a government scientist for the Vermont Lakes and Ponds Management and Protection Program since 2001. So the perspective I am going to share with you is from my personal experience and observations, which is going to be relatable for some of you, but perhaps different for many of you. To put my perspective in context, Vermont is the sixth smallest state in the United States. It's got less than 650,000 people. So the same number of people that live in Las Vegas, well, live in Vermont. Vermont has a little over 800 lakes, and it is located in a very lake-rich region of North America. There's been a lot of successful lake management in Vermont. And while I think it's safe to say all relied on peer-reviewed science, ultimately, time and time again, it came down to state scientists having to collect the evidence the problem was here and educate policymakers. These are two areas identified in the recent Grand Challenges survey done by Catherine, Steve, Kathy, and Mike and their co-authors, and it's the areas in which we need to make progress. Quote, the single most powerful image in the history of limnology, end quote, as James Elser called it, was taken of Lake 226 in the Experimental Lakes area in northwestern Ontario and showed the half of the lake with added phosphorus as starkly green. The year was 1973. 4 years later, Jeannie Garrison of the Vermont Lakes and Ponds Management and Protection Program started the Spring Phosphorus or Spring P sampling program, focusing in on total phosphorus. Ginny was a NALMS Region 1 director from 1986 to 1989 and winner of the very prestigious Secchi Disc Award. Because of Ginny's early adoption of the monitoring of total phosphorus, Vermont had evidence that a lake called Lake Maury had elevated phosphorus levels. And in the early 1980s, Vermont applied for and was awarded a $200,000 Section 314 Clean Lakes Program grant from EPA to do a diagnostic study on Lake Maury and another lake in the state. In 1986, using the findings from the Phase 1 diagnostic study on Lake Maury, an alum treatment was successfully conducted with funding again from a 314 Clean Lakes program. Post-alum treatment monitoring determined the treatment was a success, and it's only now we are seeing a decline in the water quality of that lake. For those wanting to hear more about Lake Maury alum treatment and the state of that lake today, I encourage you to attend Mark Mitchell's talk on Thursday. For those who don't know, Section 314 of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Lakes Program, has not been funded since 1995. NALMS has a working group named after 314 that aims to advocate for the need for federal funding for U.S. lakes. To hear more about that, I encourage you to attend Chris's talk entitled An Update on the 314 Working Group Activities this Thursday. In 2016, Stoddard et al., using results from the first two national lake assessments, found that the U.S. was losing its oligotrophic lakes on a continental basis. This made us ask whether that phenomenon was happening in Vermont. Using 3 separate Vermont DEC monitoring data sets, my colleague Dr. Leslie Matthews was able to determine that Vermont is in fact losing its oligotrophic lakes. Because of these findings, lake associations on oligotrophic lakes have applied for funding to develop lake watershed action plans to identify sources of phosphorus in their watersheds and come up with a plan to abate it. Without Vermont's long-term phosphorus data, no action would be taken at this time as these lakes still have amazing water quality. As such, I am hopeful that Vermont will be able to turn these trends around as it was able to do so on the oligotrophic Lake Seymour over a 10-year period with all the work they did in the watershed and promoting lake-friendly practices through the LakeWise program. However, the latest results from the 2022 National Lake Assessment show that I cannot extend that hope to the nation's remaining oligotrophic lakes. Between 2012 and 2022, the nation lost half of its remaining oligotrophic lakes, going from 15% of the nation's lakes in 2012 to 7% in just 10 years. For more about the results from the 2022 National Lake Assessment, I encourage you to attend Lorena Gunzel's talk on Thursday at 9:20. Over my career, however, the grand challenge Vermont's lakes faced that I think exemplified the findings of the Freshwater Imperative surveys then and now was Vermont's lack of statewide regulation of lakeshore development. In 1970, Vermont passed the Shoreline Protection Act, and then it was passively repealed in 1975. For the ensuing 39 years, there were many attempts to pass similar legislation to no avail. Vermont DEC lake scientists kept pointing to the overwhelming evidence in the literature that setting development back from lake shores and retaining natural tiers of vegetation between the development and the lake was one of the most important things lake managers could do to protect aquatic habitat, biota, and reduce localized runoff of phosphorus and sediment. This comports with the findings of the Grand Challenges Survey that we need more policy support to make progress. In 2003, the Jennings et al. Paper came out in NALMS' journal Lake and Reservoir Management, and we adapted the methods in that paper and conducted a study that determined that unregulated development violated Vermont's water quality standards in our state. But then the opportunity came when there was an administration change in Vermont in 2011. Peter Shumlin was elected as governor. He appointed David Mears as commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Soon after Commissioner Mears started, we presented him with all the science we had both researched in the literature as well as our own findings from our littoral habitat studies and the National Lakes Assessment. The take-home message was that Vermont needed to copy Maine's Mandatory Shoreline Protection Act, which Maine had copied from Vermont back in 1972. Commissioner Mears was on board, and as such, he then convinced his supervisor, then Agency of Natural Resources Secretary Deb Markowitz, who then convinced the governor that he needed to support a Shoreline Protection Act. While we had data to show unregulated development was bad for Vermont lakes, we needed to show there was a policy solution to this problem. We needed to measure littoral habitat and biota off of developed sites that had a buffer between the development and the lake. Luckily, we had just the place to collect that data, but it wasn't in Vermont. Maine had copied Vermont's Shoreline Protection Act in 1971, but unlike Vermont, it did not repeal it and actually made it stronger over time. Collaborating with aquatic biologists from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection's Lakes program, we found that it is possible to develop a lakeshore and minimize impacts to aquatic habitat and biota. It simply meant following Maine's mandatory Shoreland Zoning Act. Commissioner Mears then hired Trey Martin as Senior Counsel for Government Affairs. Trey was a gifted liaison between the Vermont DEC and the Vermont legislature. In 2012, he was able to build partnerships with a number of environmental groups and laid the groundwork for a Shoreland Protection Act. Trey was an exceptional communicator who grasped the science and can convey it to policymakers. In 2013, we released our 2 white papers with results that were specific to Vermont's lakes. I testified to the legislature and saw firsthand how receptive Vermont's politicians were to accepting the evidence that unregulated development was causing harm to Vermont's lakes, and they had the power to rectify that. In 2014, the Vermont legislature passed the Shoreline Protection Act. It took 39 years to pass a version of what the legislature had passed in 1971. Thankfully, it was in place when the pandemic hit and a huge turnover of lakefront property happened in Vermont. If you'd like to see how Vermont DEC scientists are tackling another lake management challenge, I encourage you to attend Lizzie Gallagher's Friday presentation on Vermont's wake sports rule, an aquatic invasive species risk assessment for lakes and ponds with defined wake sports zones. State, tribal, and provincial aquatic scientists don't have the capacity to do this kind of applied science, to develop the tools lake managers need to protect and rehabilitate our lakes and reservoirs from the stresses of climate change and biodiversity loss. We need better collaboration with the academic, nonprofit, environmental consultants, and policymakers. I think NALMS is well positioned to play a key role in helping foster those collaborations. In a final plug, I invite you to attend the talk I will be giving on Friday, where I will be presenting a lake management framework that lays out the players and steps we need to engage for successful lake management. My key takeaways are that we need to find ways to support more adaptive applied science for challenges that are constantly evolving because government scientists really don't have the resources or the time to keep up with them all. That we need to do a better job sharing our knowledge with the policymakers, and we need to protect our remaining oligotrophic and high-quality lakes before they are gone forever. We need to advocate on behalf of lakes and reservoirs to significantly increase the funding for their protection and rehabilitation. Thank you for listening.